This meeting is, in a way, a vindication that the best plans of capitalism do not always work out, either in their favour or in favour of the working classes. This is actually the centenary year of the establishment of the states of Northern Ireland and the Free State, as it was then, which later became the Republic of Ireland. The Northern State, in particular, was established from the beginning on a sectarian agenda. There was a majority of the population carved off to create a Protestant-dominated population, a Protestant-dominated electorate, and a minority Catholic electorate. And it affected the working class in the north, and it affected the working class in the south. And first of all, the sheer division of the border itself, splitting trade unions and splitting workers on a national basis, but also on a sectarian basis. And it has taken a long, long time for people to accommodate the situation. Neither state was an economic success. Neither was a great political or social success. But we arrive at a situation now where 100 years later, after an agreement to resolve a military dispute, mainly coming from the Catholic population, which itself was the usurping of a civil rights movement in the 60s that later degenerated into a sectarian fight and into a sectarian war and into a political war against the British state in particular. 23 years ago, an agreement was reached, and as far as I'm concerned, it was actually a recognition of the surrender of the militarists on all sides. There was no victory, because those who set out to liberate Northern Ireland at the end of a 30-year war didn't have a single square inch of territory that they could call free. They finished up the same borders they started with. But one of the things that among the things that they achieved was they achieved an agreement that would allow political representation of the sectarians and of the militarists into an assembly. But it was constructed in such a way that neither could achieve immediate majorities. There was also a clause in it that if at any time the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland determined that there was a majority of the population in favour of reuniting Ireland, that it would be put to a referendum of the people. Now, there's some agitation has started on that, particularly by the Sinn Fein currents. But it has to be said that in the 23 years that Northern Ireland has existed without the major war, and it was a major war, without that, Sinn Fein has been equally as bad as its opponents from the other side of the sectarian divide in administering the austerity programme of the various governments, whether Labour or Tory in Britain. They have been well rewarded and well appreciated for the role that they have played at the expense of the working class. The question that's to be discussed here today is to try and, first of all, get an understanding exactly what's going on the ground, and to try and work out perspectives for the future and for the role for socialists and trade unionists. We've a range of speakers here who have grown up in the state that is now Northern Ireland, and all are witnesses to the Troubles, as the 30-year war was called. But there are also people who have been active in fighting for socialism and fighting for trade union rights during that period. The first speaker is Michael Craig. I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Hello, comrades. Uh, yeah, I can speak with an understanding of both communities here. I was born an atheist, uh, but my father came from a family, of the Orange Order. And when he was a young man, he and his brother and his sister dropped all that, became atheists, and joined the Communist Party of Northern Ireland. Uh, they didn't teach me much about politics. They left that to us, Um, and so anyway,
Das ist so eine Scheiße heute hier.
somebody's talking there. Can you mute? Uh, so anyway, I grew up among Protestants, working class Protestants, farmers, what have you. I know how to think, and I married an armed Republican and disarmed her, so I know how they think as well. And neither of the way that people in Britain think that these two sides think is the truth. There's far more to it than that. Unionism is not one homogenous group. It has several groups in it, and the the loyalists. You would think that, yeah, they call them loyalists, so they must be more loyal to the crown than the unionists are. No, they're not. It's nothing to do with that. It was just a way of separate themselves from what they called big house unionism. And it basically started in 1903 when the Independent Orange Order was formed, because the Ulster Unionist Party and the Orange Order had sort of joined together and represented big business and the landowners at the expense of working class people who counted themselves as British. Uh, Also, the Connolly, this, if you're talking about what's going on in the last couple of weeks with the young people rioting, you have to understand uh, a bit of the history. That the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, is a bit like, to be honest, it's a bit like the Nazi Party. It came out of rural middle class farmers and sucked in a lot of the working class and used them the way the middle class and the upper class always have. But that's where it came from, and it was had a lot of fundamental Christianity attached to it. It's Calvinism. Uh, Whenever it became a major force in the 70s, the Ulster Unionists themselves became a different kind of unionist. They had been in power here up until they were chucked out in 1972 for about 50 years. They represent the bourgeois, big business, and uh, but they want to be seen as being non-sectarian British Irish people, uh, which to an extent a lot of them are. They're not interested in sectarianism. They wish it would go away. So it's not them that's behind, the troubles here. It's the DUP. The DUP have shot themselves in the foot. They paid for Brexit. They weren't caught out quite by it because of the change in rules about MPs and parties revealing their expenses that came in a couple of years ago. It was backdated, but it wasn't backdated far enough to cover the time when the DUP actually funded Brexit. Uh, Not only did they fund Brexit, but they made every manoeuvre when they sort of held the balance of power in Stormont under May's government to make sure that there was no sort of deal with, a single market or anything else, to make sure it was a clean break, sort of ultra nationalism. Um, and they're the ones that have the voices. They're the ones you hear on the radio and the TV and in the papers. You don't hear other unionists. In among the loyalist groups, there's a party called the Progressive Unionist Party, which is quite small, but it doesn't represent a lot of that loyalist community who have some progressive politics. Uh, uh, just after the fighting had ended last week, a young researcher called Sophie Long wrote an article talking about the progressive unionism, which sort of overlaps with the PUP, the Progressive Unionist Party, explaining a bit of their history and why they are at where they're at. And there's a lot of truth in it. If anybody has heard of David Irvine, who was the leader of the PUP, he was counted before he died as being the most eloquent of all unionist speakers in history. And he represented working class loyalism. And he brokered the peace deal and made helped to make the loyalists lay down their arms.
Hast du Gewitter oder was?
Can somebody mute? Thanks. Lay down their arms. Well, David Irvine's father was a socialist and was not in the Orange Order and had no history of being involved in unionism at all. Now that was the case with many people, including people that my parents would have known in East Belfast, where in the 1950s there was a communist party which had hundreds of members in it, and they were the ones that formed the Northern Ireland Labour Party. They also were on the right side of history when it came to things like the Ulster Workers' Council strike. They opposed it. Now, I'm not saying everybody in the Northern Ireland Labour Party did, but certainly that communist group did. They were on the right side of the civil rights history because they were involved in civil rights. I mean, everybody knows the names of Betty Sinclair and Jimmy Stewart and people like that. They were all on the right side of history. So anyway, Sophie Long says that this whole thing didn't just start with the protocol or with the COVID lockdowns. It started long ago with, as Jimmy said, the Good Friday Agreement, which was designed by capitalists to protect their interests. Nothing in the Good Friday Agreement was written by working class Catholics or Protestants in Northern Ireland. Tony Blair, Senator George Mitchell, Bertie Ahern, you name it, representatives of capitalism. They wrote it, and they wrote it in such a way, as Jimmy described, that it's a forced coalition between two opposing groups where they don't have to ever compromise with each other. It gives them positions of power where they get paid well, and there's a gravy train industry around it all, and they are not motivated to change any of it. The whole argument about British people who want to remain British in Northern Ireland is not just one of colonialism, because not all of the people in Ulster were planted there. In counties Antrim and Down, there was a Protestant population there before plantation, maybe 80 or 90 years before it, who took over land that nobody was on. They didn't evict the natives, and that was where if you look at the map today, that's where the highest concentration of pro-British citizens live. So, there is a right after, nearly 400 years for those people to remain part of Britain if they want to. And that, of course, is used all the time by the sectarians to not give an inch and not compromise. But it still is a right that we have to recognise. We should never just go for a capitalist united Ireland and forget about all those people who've been here, have roots here for hundreds of years. And that would be the same as saying that, we'll have a treaty in the United States where the natives take over and everybody from Europe moves back home. And that's the way they would see it. Yeah, and there's some truth in that. It would be irrational. It just history moves on, and whenever people are settled in a place, they become part of it, and that has to be recognised. Well, that hasn't been recognised, and so this is used as a football to back up the DUP's version of unionism. During the rioting a couple of weeks ago, many of the more progressive loyalists in the around the Shankill interface went there to try and stop it, and they were told to go and F yourself by the kids. Those kids have been left with no jobs, no hope, nothing. One of the things that happened during the Troubles was before the Fair Employment Act and all came in, was that Catholics couldn't get jobs. So they went, with free education, they went and got themselves educated, and then they got jobs. The heavy industry that the Protestants had always depended on for work disappeared, as it did throughout Britain with the onset of neoliberalism. And so they had nothing to fall back on, and that's why you get these great pockets of poverty and all in the loyalist areas. And so you bring on top of that this threat that there's going to be a border which will, just ignore all of their heritage, and then the fact that they can't get a job, and those young people are living on 60 or 70 quid a week. Whenever somebody says to them, if you go out and riot, you're not only risking your life, but you're risking your future. You'll have a criminal record and all the rest of it. They just stick two fingers up to that there, because what hope have they anyway? So there is no solution to these problems unless it is a transformation of society, and in that transformation we have to recognise those legitimate rights of people who want to be British. Now, during the Republicans never really talked about socialism since partition. They talked about the stages theory, where first of all you had to get 6 counties and have an all-Ireland republic, and then we'll talk about Labour, socialism. Well, they've had 26 of those counties for 100 years. If they had changed that narrative, to socialism, and they had worked for a health service, and they had fought all the reaction that Connolly told us would happen, if they'd fought all that and left the Republic, even the term of it, the All-Ireland Republic, if they'd left that in the background, you would have won a lot of the Protestant working class to the cause of socialism, because they would have. One of the things about Northern Ireland was that since partition, its economy had shrunk, and at the same time, although it had a bit of a shaky start, the Republic's economy grew, and with that growth, if there had been a call for socialism instead of an all-Ireland Republic, there could have been a free at the point of need health service and all sorts of things, where there would have been no reason, there would have been no economic reason for working class unionists to think, yeah, we'll be better off there, so let's have United Ireland. So Harry's going to talk a bit about the history of it, so I'll leave it at that.
Comrades, I mean, Mike has discussed there about the diverse trends that existed, in unionism and nationalism. And I really want to do the same in regard to the labour and the trade union movement, that throughout their entire history almost on the national question, there has been diverse trends that has led them at times to take action, and it led them at times to take inaction. And no matter what way you do from the labour and the trade union movement, I mean, one of the biggest mistakes is that you avoid the national question. And it really is a central issue in Ireland that the labour and trade union has in the past taken up, but very often sets aside and ignored, and is ignored. The national question in Ireland is still, despite the centenary, is a key question, not just for the north here, but also in the south. It has dominated Irish politics throughout the entire century, and in fact will continue to do so. Sinn Fein, becoming probably the new form of government, has made it very clear that their agenda, as their main slogan, is for United Ireland, and that's why you should vote for them. If we go back to the trade unions in the early days, it was a key factor in how the trade unions were organised in Ireland. And when Larkin set up the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in 1907, it was very much the key question. It did, of course, develop in Ireland, and indeed it developed in Britain, as indeed many unions did, both in the British state and indeed the Irish state. Larkin at the time was very much opposed to nationalism, even in any way being involved in the trade union movement. He once said that nationalism shouldn't be imported into the labour movement. Although, to be honest with you, what he did was by setting up as an all-Ireland union, which became by far the biggest union, certainly for decades later, he did just that. The question of whether it would be a British trade union movement or an Irish, it was certainly predominantly an Irish trade union throughout all of the 32 counties. When he, and along with Connolly and O'Brien, set up the Irish Labour Party in 1912, it was to be an all-Ireland party, Labour Party throughout all the 32 counties. And for the British Labour Party, although they objected to it at that time, they conceded that this would be the Irish Labour Party, would be an all-Ireland party. Now, from the very outset, it began repercussions in the north. In the north, there was a breakaway within the trade union movement, and they began to set up their own formation. There was the Ulster Unionist Labour Association, which really was the nucleus to the Northern Ireland Labour Party, began to set up. And they became really central and very much affected, or very much under the British Labour Party in Britain. And that's really how they developed throughout the rest of that century. If you go forward, I'll talk about them actually in a moment, because I think it's very important, because what it really turned out, the Northern Ireland Labour Party, was very much a reactionary political party, divisive, that segregated and really more concentrated more on the unity of Britain, and really avoided, and in fact became an obstacle to any form of Ireland, socialist or otherwise. But for the Irish Labour Party, there were key events that intervention, had they have done so, could have transformed history. In the 1918 general election, you must remember that the issue of home rule at this stage was way down the agenda. The third Home Rule Bill had been already passed before the war had broke out. And for many in the Irish Labour Party, home rule was inevitable. It wasn't really a question. The key question really was partition, and what was to do with the northern state. And remember that industrially, Belfast was about the industrial heartland for the whole of Ireland, and was organised under the trade union movement. But if you go back to that period, the strength of the labour and the trade union movement grew enormously. Certainly after the 16 Rising, where Connolly had thrown in the Irish Citizens' Army along with the Irish volunteers in the rising. And that certainly set the agenda of a very powerful labour movement after 16, but more so a year later in the Bolshevik Revolution. Because in Ireland at that time, the organised workers right throughout Ireland was very much organised in trade unions, about 250,000. Half of them were organised within the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, but also sprung up trade union councils right throughout Ireland. I mean, from say 1918 to about 21, trades councils grew from about 16 to well over 40. So they were highly organised, mass demonstrations, and many of them, of course, that was looking towards the Bolshevik Revolution as a model, and a model of socialism that could be transported to Ireland. Of course, there was the Worker Soviets that was set up. None more so than this one here, the Limerick Soviet, probably one of the most famous ones that was set up throughout Ireland. So what it was at that stage, a golden opportunity for the labour and the trade union movement to transform and to intervene in Ireland, and particularly in the 1918 election. Now, republicanism or nationalism, of course, also grew enormously. And there was a question of whether or not the Irish Labour Party would stand aside and allow Sinn Fein effectively a free hand in the election. And that goes back, as Mike has mentioned there, about the stages theory. In comes again the stages theory. Let's have nationalism, let's have an independent, and we'll deal with socialism at a later stage. And that's effectively what happened. The Labour movement was split then on whether or not they should stand in the election. Most of them certainly were opposed to partition, although not in the north. But it was really at that stage to appeal. The key question was partition. At that stage, particularly at the period of the time after the Bolshevik Revolution, there was the agenda to set up the appeal for a new Ireland, appeal to Protestants that the Westminster had nothing to offer them, but also in the Dáil that the bourgeois parties that were going to take power, that did take power and dominated for decades and decades, right up to the present day, also had nothing to offer. And that regard Sinn Fein themselves would really be, it would be a bourgeois state in the south, and they didn't intervene, largely because they were split on the question. Sinn Fein themselves very much wanted Labour to join them in a coalition, and that was where the Labour must wait. As apparently allegedly it was De Valera who came out with that vote, although it is contested whether or not. But Sinn Fein at the time certainly saw the Labour Party as a party of theirs. The Labour Party, Sinn Fein is one and the same, was a quote that De Valera came out with. So they stood back, and they stood back again in 1921. And it wasn't really until 1923 that they began to have some opposition, and indeed they were the largest opposition party in the Dáil post that for a period of time. And then, of course, the subsequent decades, many of you know the history as well as I do, probably better, is the subsequent Irish Labour Party went into coalitions probably 6, 7 times throughout that period of time. And really, to be honest with you, by the 1950s, had abandoned the working class as a working class organisation. They were seen very much as a bourgeois organisation. And to this day, there's now completely degenerated. They've ostracized themselves from the trade union movements almost entirely. And today really is not the voice of the trade unions in Ireland, in the south. In the north of Ireland, they're developed then from the kind of the Ulster Labour Association. There was the Belfast Labour Party, and that evolved then into the Northern Ireland Labour Party in 1924, I think it is, that they were actually set up. And this became a very reactionary Labour Party throughout their history. They very much sided themselves on the British model. And although they got some Westminster seats, they had some gains also to Stormont throughout the Unionist government's times. But really towards the end, again, missed opportunities, not just for the Northern Ireland Labour Party, but the trade union movement were missed. The civil rights movement was undoubtedly one of the biggest events that took place in the North in the last century. It was a predominantly Catholic uprising, whereas our late colleague John Throne would often refer to as the Bogside Uprising. And it had a great deal of sympathy in what their demands were: civil rights, right to vote, proper housing, all of these that had an echo within the Protestant working class. And likewise, it was the lack of inaction at a very, very crucial stage that could have had united the working class in the north of Ireland behind the civil rights movement that again could have changed history. But that was not done. And as I say, it's not the Northern Ireland, it was the trade union movement in general that refused to participate in that. By the 1970s, there then became the emergence of what was sectarian parties, none more so than the Social Democratic and Labour Party. Many people in the Labour Party joined the SDLP. Paddy Devlin probably the most notable, but many others. And although Devlin and people like that there saw the SDLP as a socialist party, the party was really the wing that was one was more the Catholic sectarian John Hume version of the party. It became a bourgeois party, but a very sectarian one. And the Labour Party in Britain recognised the SDLP as their sister party in Northern Ireland, sidelining the Northern Ireland Labour Party. And that position remains to this very day. Now, to add insult to injury, when you look at the Northern Ireland Labour Party, I mean, for example, the border poll of 1973, the Labour Party in Northern Ireland urged people to vote for union with Britain. And that immediately divided the party. Any Catholics were in the Northern Ireland Labour completely left because of that position that they took. And they add insult to injury a few years later, sorry, in 1973, the Northern Ireland Labour Party supported the Ulster workers' strike, a loyalist sectarian strike that brought the country to a standstill and brought an end to what was a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland. In other words, what they wanted was a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. And it demonstrates the reaction that the Northern Ireland Labour Party had throughout that period and indeed the latter periods. On a more positive note, when the Labour movement takes an initiative, 1992, there was a spate of sectarian killings. And a small trades council, I myself was the secretary in those days, and actually currently the chairperson of it, we called for a workers' strike after an IRA bomb blew up 8 workers, no more than about 10 miles from where I live. Small trades council, but organised in key industrial parks in this local area in Mid-Ulster. And we called for the Irish Congress of Trade Unions to back the strike. They initially declined, called us whatever. But thankfully, with our intervention from the broader trade union movement and largely members of the militant in those days, we forced the ICTU to back the strike. There was about 2,500 people come out against all sectarian killings, Republican, loyalist, and state killings. And we brought about 2,500 people out here. That was followed up by the ICTU organising the same similar demonstration in Belfast, a demonstration that was one of the biggest ever to assemble in Belfast City against sectarian killings. Now, what that did was, in fact, to change the objective situation. People had turned their back on all forms of violence, Republican, loyalist, and state violence, and they wanted a new agenda. 5 years later was the Good Friday Agreement. Really, when you look at it, it was the trade union movement that changed that objective situation, led OK to a bourgeois initiative that was the Good Friday Agreement. Mike has dealt with that in what he was saying earlier. Although the decline of the Irish Labour Party, the Labour Party in Northern Ireland continued to go along. 4 or 5 years later, when Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, it transformed also the Labour Party in Northern Ireland. we became the second numerically membership, the second largest party in Northern Ireland. A huge opportunity had opened up. The trade unions in the north of Ireland were looking at affiliating to the Northern Ireland Labour Party and transforming it. Meetings would be 200-300 at a time with trade unionists, activists from all backgrounds. It was a party that, it is true, that many Catholics stroke nationalists joined, probably because more so that Jeremy Corbyn in all his years as backbencher would very much have an open voice. He met Gerry Adams a number of times. He had a Republican agenda, not quite the one that we would advocate, I think, as socialist, but certainly it was a nationalist agenda. And certainly many people joined the Northern Ireland Labour Party at that time, 4 years ago. And subsequently, the party was greatly undermined. Again, we go back to the stages theory. There was a key number of activists who were stroke nationalist, stroke Labour, very influential in the party. About 7 or 8 of them resigned en masse in the hope of bringing down the Northern Ireland Labour Party, effectively abolishing it altogether. That wasn't quite achieved because many of the activists then rallied around. We stood under what is called the right to stand. It's a right to stand. We've a campaign that still goes on at the very moment, that the Northern Ireland Labour Party has got the right to stand candidates in the Labour Party name here in Northern Ireland. The British Labour Party refuses to give that. In fact, only it wasn't until 2004 that they actually agreed that Northern Ireland Labour Party would organise members and so on here in Northern Ireland. And it was these trends within the Labour movement who were involved in the Northern Ireland Labour Party, again goes down. We don't want the Labour Party. What we want is a united Ireland under capitalism, and we'll deal with the socialist aspects after that. And as I said, it damaged a great opportunity that existed 3, 4, 5 years ago. It damaged us, and we are left today, as to be quite honest with you, not more than a bit of a lump of a party. We still have quite a large number of members, 1,500, 1,600, quite large numerically, but our influence, the trade union orientation had gone. Trade unions just refused really to have anything more to do with us, and today we're nothing more than a small, quite large numerically, but really our influence has been greatly diminished since they pulled out. And this is because people within the trade unions and labour activists, so-called labour activists, wanted to destroy this initiative. Again, going back to the stages theory. There's a great deal of talk today about border polls, and that's on the agenda, very much for the people of Northern Ireland, but also a key question for trade unionists and members of the Labour Party. The border poll, there was one in 1973. It didn't really come into anything because the nationalists refused to participate in the election, and they called for abstention. So really what it turned out to be in 1973 was, despite a 60% turnout, 98.5 voted to remain with the UK. A similar situation could happen today. There's a lot of calls for a border poll today. Now, as socialists, we would not encourage a border poll, largely because a border poll will not achieve anything. If anything, it will divide a very sectarian state even more, may even divide the trade union movement, again, as it did in 1973, and it will achieve nothing. Again, all it will achieve will be nothing more than the stages theory. Let's have imposed a united Ireland. It's under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, enforce or coerce Protestants to have a new Ireland, and then we'll deal with the social and economic aspects of it. A very, very dangerous situation. And incidentally, it's possible that even unionists could well abstain. I mean, numerically and in electoral terms, nationalists today hold a tiny majority in as far as electoral terms are concerned. So the balance has really gone very much towards Catholics stroke nationalists. If unionists abstained, it would just become the same course of 1973. nothing would happen and it would achieve nothing. To really round up about the different trends, I mean, for example, there's a trade unionist for a new United Ireland, and it gives you some example of the way forward, perhaps not to take it. I mean, even in the name, that is not a name that should be advocated for a new Ireland. When I was a member of the militant way back in the 80s, 90s to the early part of the century here, we used to stand for a socialist United. Is that the United would be seen very much as a bourgeois United, and we ended up dropping that, the United from our slogan. We call for a socialist Ireland. And from the very name of this, for this approach within the trade union movement by, for example, this new group, is not the way to deal with this. But when you look at what was mentioned within, they talk about things like the trade union rights, equality, and for in fact, I don't even think socialism's mentioned in this. That will not have any appeal whatsoever to the Protestants in the North. Calling for simple rights. I mean, all parties in many ways just very blandly call for equal rights, talks equality, uniting the working class, all of that type of stuff is not really going to appeal to the Protestant. What we really need is a trade union movement at this stage. It needs new political representation in the North and in the South. The Labour Party in the South is now just seen as nothing more, no influence, no echo whatsoever with the working class. The Irish Congress for Trade Unions is organised throughout Ireland, in the North and in the South. And what it really needs is a new formation, a workers' formation, an Ireland Labour Party, what needs to emerge now from the trade union movement, and to take up the issues that on a social and economic agenda, but also the question of the national question. The key thing about any movement on the national question is workers' unity throughout the organised labour and the trade union movement in Ireland. Uniting the working class on this. Dealing with issues like the border poll, but also dealing with issues, and particularly to appeal to Protestants in the North, that a Protestant state that Westminster has nothing to offer the workers, people in the north of Ireland, or for that matter, a bourgeois Dáil has got nothing to offer. Not only Protestant, but also Catholics. We need a new agenda based on the labour and the trade union movement. And that's what needs to develop. The Northern Ireland Labour Party to move away. It's very much integrated with the British Labour Party. We get delegates to conference. We attend conference. It needs to move away. We need a new formation here, which will probably split the Northern Ireland Labour Party. But even if it does, it may be for the better. We need an all-Ireland Labour Party in the North and the South based on the trade union movements, And that's what the whole agenda needs to be set now, that whole agenda. So I'll leave it there for discussion, Jimmy.
Okay, Harry, thank you very much. I was a bit indulgent with you there, but it was important because you covered a fair amount of territory, not just in an abstract historical way, but in a way of understanding the class issues involved as well, and the role of the parties and the failures of the parties of Labour. I'm now going to ask Eileen to come in, and Eileen has a long history too in the socialist movement and the trade union movement, and I haven't restricted in any way what Eileen's going to say, so it's going to be a certain amount of surprise for me too. But she has a tremendous background and respect and authority among activists in the Derry area, and she has a history, personal history, that any activist will be proud of. So it's all yours, Eileen.
Thanks, Jimmy. I suppose I fell into an awful pit of nostalgia when Jimmy asked me to do this, because I found myself reminiscing an awful lot about my I suppose, my activist life. And my first conscious political event would have been in 1966. I'm originally from the Falls Road in West Belfast. And in 1966 was the 50-year anniversary celebration of the 1916 uprising in Dublin. And there was a massive parade and procession up the Falls Road because it coincided with Gerry Fitt being elected. And Gerry Fitt was elected under the banner of Republican Labour, which was a new one on me as a young teenager. And it's when I first became aware as well of James Connolly and what James Connolly stood for, as opposed to, you know, Padraig Pearse and the other people involved in the rising in Dublin. And Gerry Fitt on that day, he was up on the back of a coal lorry coming up the Falls Road, and the procession stopped outside the house where James Connolly used to live when he was a trade union organizer in Belfast. And he spoke about Connolly. And I then sussed out and sourced some writings of Connolly. And, you know, for over those 50 years, he's been my hero from that era and from that ilk as a revolutionary who wasn't the right-wing nationalist that we had seen in Belfast and Derry, you know, in the 50s and 60s, and in Derry, Eddie McAteer and all that right-wing petty bourgeois nationalism. I thought, well, they don't represent me. And I was taken with Gerry Fitt at the time, who, as I say, was Republican Labour and stood for election under that tag. And around the same time, 66, Paisley was raising his ugly sectarian head. And later that year, Peter Ward was one of the first in the current troubles, if you like, to have been murdered. Peter Ward was an 18-year-old barman in Shankill Road, and he was shot dead. I knew Peter. I knew Peter from going to the local Cayleys on the Falls Road in the Cluan Ard and the Ard Skull. And it was a terrible shock, you know, personally, but also it sent tremors of shockwaves throughout the community. You know, this hadn't happened for a long time. And this was a blatant sectarian murder, absolutely straight on the back of the sectarian rampants of Ian Paisley, no question about that. So that was 1966. 68, the civil rights movement was gaining traction. My first, I suppose, political act was sitting down in Lillenhall Street in 1968. I joined the civil rights movement and also the People's Democracy, which was basically a kind of a middle-class student movement, but I was involved with them and sat down at the first big, you know, street protest in the middle of Belfast city centre. And, you know, the civil rights movement for me, their programme was what I believed in. My parents would have been very non-sectarian, and they were both from the south of Ireland, from County Cavan and County Leitrim, came up to Belfast during the war, married in Belfast, etc. And they would have had a sort of socialist bent. You know, there wasn't a sectarian bone in their bodies. And so for me, the civil rights movement, looking for equality in relation to housing and voting and education and jobs, that bill suited me fine. Then joined the militant in the autumn of 1971. I just started university, and shortly afterwards I joined the Northern Ireland Labour Party, the Derry branch, and I was a member of the Northern Ireland Labour Party Young Socialists. Would have been a representative of the NILPYS at various international events alongside comrades in the LPYS in Britain. And 1973, as Harry just alluded to, the Derry Labour Party were expelled from the Northern Ireland Labour Party, as were Newton Abbey Labour Party, who would have been Innes and Vinnie McCormick, would have been Newton Abbey Labour Party at the time. So and I have to say, I was proud to be expelled from the Northern Ireland Labour Party at that time, because it was a rotten right-wing Labour unionist outfit. And there was no leeway at all. It was okay to raise issues about sectarianism, but it was not okay to raise any issues about state violence or state repression or Bloody Sunday in Derry or the repressive legislation. That was a no-no for the Northern Ireland Labour Party at that time. I guess we all would have left in due course anyway, but as it happens, we were expelled for daring to mention issues such as state violence and state repression. And again, Harry alluded to the UWC strike, which they supported, which was an absolute sellout and scandal. Any trace of socialism disappeared with the support for that. I remember sitting in McGee University, Great Hall in Derry in 1974, doing my finals by candlelight as a result of the UWC, the Ulster Workers' Council strike in 1974. So we don't need to get into the gubbins of it and the detail. Everybody will know then that 30 plus years of warfare. The provisional IRA, okay, had an agenda against the state in terms of a war against the police and the army, but they were heavily involved in many civilian sectarian murders, no question about that, as were the other side, the loyalist paramilitaries involved in blatant, hateful sectarian murders. Several of my friends were murdered. Just a chance Catholic. My very good friend Rosemary McCartney, summer of 72, was a victim of one of those bogus taxi calls, and she and her boyfriend Paddy O'Neill from Ardoyne were found murdered and their bodies mutilated 5 days after their disappearance in the Forth River Road in Belfast. That's just one example. So I got the horror of sectarianism in my gut many times when friends of mine were killed, just random sectarian murders. So during all of that time, it was very difficult to plough a middle path, not a middle politically, but plough a path through this sectarianism to hold the banner of socialism and the red flag aloft. It was very, very difficult. I was a member of Derry Trades Council from 1978 for almost 40 years. We didn't miss the ball when we slated sectarianism wherever it raised its head and tried to raise these issues in the trade union movement. I was active in NIPSA and at various levels of the organization throughout my working life. For instance, for almost 20 years, our branch in Derry moved a motion to our annual conference of NIPSA calling for an independent public inquiry into the events of Bloody Sunday. It got hammered every year, year on year on year, and every year we brought the motion, and eventually it was passed. And then NIPSA brought the motion from our union to the annual conference of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and subsequently got it passed there, which was in no small measure, what resulted in the Savile inquiry. Not to be all and end all in terms of the families of the victims of Bloody Sunday, but still it was movement along the issue. But a lot of those issues were really difficult to raise, and to raise them from a class point of view, not a sectarian point of view. But of course you were accused of, if you mentioned Bloody Sunday, you were accused of being a Republican, which I never was. I never was a member or anywhere close to any Republican organization. But so much so that in the late 70s, there was a publication on the water side of Derry called, I think it was called Searchlight or Spotlight. It was basically a UDA paper, Ulster Defence Association, in which they printed the Derry Trades Council executives, all their names and addresses and phone numbers. It was very frightening time. Bill Webster would have been the secretary of the Trades Council at that time. So on the one hand, you had the horrible sectarian murders and attacks going on for over 30 years, and the trade union movement trying to hold it together, and organizations like Derry Trades Council. We move on to the Good Friday Agreement 1998. In my opinion, in our opinion, all it did was institutionalize the sectarianism, make it a wee bit more polite looking than the murders. And, our stance at that stage in 1998, if ever it has been proved correct, the last few weeks have proved that. The Assembly is an institution based on sectarianism, and there's no way around that. The various guises of the Assembly that have come and gone and fallen and come back, away for 3 years and come back, every single one of them have brought further austerity, poverty. They brought an end to public house building. They brought in the rotten Tory welfare reforms. They've done nothing to promote integrated education. They have even kept Thatcher's anti-trade union laws on the statute books 23 years after the Good Friday Agreement, when it's a devolved matter, should have been abolished immediately. Those anti-trade union laws are still on the statute books. Because sectarianism rules up at Stormont, there's no question about it. In fact, just recently, I see that Jerry Carroll from People Before Profit is bringing forward proposed legislation to take the anti-trade union laws off the statute books, called the Trade Union Freedom Bill. We'll see how that goes. We'll see how the parties flop when that is brought forward. This Assembly has refused to commission abortion services, and this is over a year after the legislation was brought in. There's been no commissioning of abortion services by Robin Swan, the Health Minister. I'm involved in Alliance for Choice in Derry, and of course we have an ongoing campaign to get the services commissioned. Women are still travelling in the middle of a pandemic to England, Scotland, Wales for abortion services. Precious Life, that outfit, have been very prominent in the last number of months. Every Monday morning for many, many weeks, they stood outside a health clinic in Newry with their horrible bloody fetus posters saying, "Babies are murdered in this clinic." They have been on the Spencer Road in Derry for the past several Thursdays outside the Waterside Health Centre with the same horrible propaganda. No arrests, nothing done. They've come from Cork, Limerick, Dublin, Ballymena to Derry, Newry, Belfast, breaking all the COVID regulations. Nothing happens to them at all. But Black Lives Matter protesters, 57 of them in Derry in June last year, were arrested and fined and summoned. In solidarity with our Brazilian sisters, we have just recently put up a board at the back of Free Derry Corner calling for solidarity and a slogan that says, everyone loves someone who has had an abortion. You're not alone. The recent sectarian outbursts in particularly Belfast, but also in areas of Derry and Larne, etc., completely the result of the DUP, mainly Arlene Foster, riling up sectarian tensions, riling up sectarian emotions around the issue of two-tier policing and the Bobby Story funeral and the Brexit Northern Ireland Protocol, those two issues. The DUP, and particularly Arlene Foster, have deliberately inflamed the situation. There have been several polls done recently which show that the DUP have fallen in their ratings in terms of public opinion polls. And there is no doubt, I think anyway, that a lot of people were angry from all sections of the population at the Bobby Story funeral, because here were people practically locked in their houses, not able to see their family, their friends, their grandchildren. And there were 2,000 plus people lined along the Falls Road. There was a huge crowd at the so-called funeral, which was actually a political meeting in Milltown Cemetery, because Bobby Story wasn't buried in Milltown. They went to the Republican plot in Milltown and held a ceremony there. Then they went to Roselawn Cemetery, where Bobby Story was cremated. So yes, there was a lot of anger around it in terms of how can these people get away with that when the rest of us are practically not allowed to move. But the decision was made by the Public Prosecution Service not to prosecute any of the leading lights of Sinn Fein for attendance at that funeral, such as Mary Lou MacDonald, Michelle O'Neill, etc., on the basis that the Public Prosecution Service felt that the regulations and the COVID rules at that time in June last year were too muddled, that it wouldn't result in a successful prosecution. And they're the decisions that the PPS have to make. Is there a chance of a successful prosecution? They decided, because the rules were so muddled, that there wasn't a chance of that, and therefore decided not to prosecute. But Arlene Foster took hold of that and ran with, this is all the fault of the PSNI. There's two-tier policing. There's one rule for Sinn Fein and Bobby Story's funeral, and there's another one for the rest of us. So she absolutely deliberately riled up sectarian feelings around that issue of two-tier policing, calling for the chief constable to resign, etc. And that is still her stance. And also then the protocol, which in January Arlene Foster said was the best thing since sliced bread for Northern Ireland, and it would be fantastic for the economy because there would be no holds barred trade between Northern Ireland and Britain or with the rest of Europe. And then, as I say, the polls dropped for the DUP, things weren't going well. So she then decided that this was the worst thing since sliced bread and there should be no border in the Irish Sea, which is an absolute nonsense. There is no border in the Irish Sea. What it means is more paperwork, more bureaucracy. This is the Brexit that the DUP voted for. The vast majority of the North's population, of course, didn't vote in favour of Brexit. However, the young people out rioting in Tully Alley in Derry and Lanark Way in Belfast have no clue whatsoever about the Northern Ireland Protocol. They have been egged on from the sidelines by leaders of loyalist paramilitaries, and there's no question about that. We saw some footage of them egging on the young people to break down the peace wall, the gate at Lanark Way, which separates, unfortunately, the two communities. And I agree, these young people are disenfranchised, they're in poverty, they're unemployed, they're ill-educated. Northern Ireland has a fantastic reputation of getting the best A-levels and GCSEs, grades A to C, in all of the United Kingdom. And that's true on one level. The other side of it is that young, and loads of research shows this, young Protestant working class boys have the poorest educational outcomes in the whole of the UK. So that's the other side of it. As I said, they had no clue about the issues that they were rioting on, but these young people who really hadn't been involved in any kind of mass sectarian activity in their lifetimes, because some of them are only 12, 13, 14 years of age. That's the legacy that Arlene Foster and the DUP and the leadership of some of the loyalist paramilitaries have left to these young people. Some legacy, that is. Meanwhile, Arlene Foster is meeting with the Loyalist Community Council, the LCC, which is comprised of the UVF and the UDA and other loyalist paramilitaries. That's the Loyalist Community Council. She's now just released, apparently a couple of days ago, £22 million to these organisations so that they can transition out of crime. I mean, I ask you, because they are led by thugs and racketeers and drug barons. That's the future, if it was left to them, for these young Protestant working class boys. As for a border poll, I would be totally opposed to a border poll. It would be nothing more than a sectarian head count. So what if it was 51% for a united Ireland and 49% against? What in God's name is that ever going to achieve? Absolutely nothing, except it has the potential to raise even higher sectarian tensions than we have at the moment. So I'm totally opposed to a border poll. There can never be a united Ireland except a socialist one. There is no other way. The centenary of Northern Ireland is this year, and linked, and there's controversy around how that's going to be commemorated, and link that to the potential for a border poll. It's a recipe for political disaster. And to paraphrase Connolly, come back to Connolly where it started, capitalism will still rule. Workers' unity and socialism is the only way forward in terms of any potential for a united socialist Ireland. And I agree with Harry's final points that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and the trade union movement are the only way forward in relation to building a political party based on the trade unions with workers' unity as its core tenet. And I feel a border poll would be completely divisive and, as I say, nothing more than a sectarian head count. So that's my take on recent events.
Okay, Eileen, on behalf of the meeting, I thank you. That was an absolutely powerful contribution. I got to ask Keith to come in now. Keith is a member of the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and he's also a member of Labour Left Alliance Northern Ireland. And he also represents the disabled section in Northern Ireland Labour as well. Originally from Newry, he's now living in Belfast, and again, Keith has a free hand on what he wishes to say in terms of how he addresses the situation there now and the future ahead.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. It's good to be invited. Yes, as you say, it is. I live in Belfast. I actually live not too far from where the violence was. You know, East Belfast. I live just over past the train station near Lanark train station. Used to be Central train station. So lucky enough, I wasn't affected, but seeing them harrowing scenes just reminded me of my childhood going forward, and the saying is, oh, we don't want to go back to that, and to see some of the ages of the ones out there, you know, through being egged on, as Eileen said, it's an absolute disgrace. We've come a long way, but I do also agree with it's been the DUP have heightened tensions here. You could see it coming, the rhetoric. Yes, I know we've had the Bobby Story funeral and stuff, yes, and I agree. Yes, it's not right calling for somebody's resignation. He can't single-handed, but the fact is the police do have something to answer for, because the people with Black Lives Matter and all were social distancing. They were social distancing and for a cause, but is it all right for their families couldn't bury their loved ones and stuff, and then you have so many thousand at a funeral? It is ridiculous. As I say, it is, and as a young person, I pride myself on being to all. I'm anti-discriminatory. I don't care what your background is, but going forward, it's like I have 2 young children, and I don't want them to grow up in that environment, because it means it's alienating. It's bringing back the old tensions, and we can't have that. As I said, and I feel for the most vulnerable in society, i.e., you know, people like myself who's disabled and stuff and the politics here in Northern Ireland is like a sectarian headcount, because if you look at the way the assembly is set up, it is set up to favour, you know, it is to promote the ones that for 30 odd years were killing people's loved ones and friends and family. We need to actively work with trade unions to get a socialist, you know, our socialist party in Northern Ireland. I'm currently, as member of the Labour Party Northern Ireland, I'm fed up with being discriminated against, not having the right to vote who I want to vote for, because there is nobody of all the political parties in Northern Ireland that have the same beliefs as I have. I want a socialist party that talks about the issues, talks about the lack of funding for NHS. I had a conversation the other day with the inter-mental health champion in Northern Ireland. I says, I see your funds, limited funds, she says, only for campaigning. There is issues. Look at the state of the nursing homes in Northern Ireland, the private companies, and especially a company Runwood Homes and with Dunmurry Manor, etc. These people are profiting, and all we're doing in Northern Ireland, there's no there's no party taking these issues head on. There's the public sector workers who've been a godsend during this pandemic. Nobody, and what does Boris Johnson give? A measly 1% pay raise. That is a disgrace. Oh, whippity doo dah, Scotland 4%. No, that's wrong. As I said, if somebody at the top gets a 10% rise, it should go down to the bottom, to the cleaner and stuff. This is why I want a party that is socialist in word and deed. I do want a Labour Party in Northern Ireland, but it has got to have my beliefs. I am not for the few. I'm for the many. I'm for the single parent, the most vulnerable, the children, because you must start from cradle to grave, and is tackling the issues like the health, totally underfunded, and we must, in Northern Ireland, they're hell-bent on getting Bangor into as the roadblock. The roadmap to building, creating our NHS, our Northern Ireland. No to Bangor, because it's privatisation through the back door. We need these issues dealt with, but on a socialist platform. And as I said, I have been discriminated as a Labour Party member in Northern Ireland since 2015. And I have taken the bull by the horns. I have launched legal action against the Labour Party across the border. In their rubric, it clearly states anti-discrimination against disability, against gender, etc. And I will take them on, and the response is inadequate, something about, so I will be taking the full case, and I'm in it to win it, and win it I will. And I want to mention this, it's coming up in the Assembly, this ban conversion therapy, trying to get people like myself, who's recently come out as gay on Valentine's Day. That is disgusting, and it should be called out for what it is. There's nothing wrong with people if you love somebody of the same sex. It's more important that talk about them issues, but they won't stand and talk down all these sectarian behaviours. That's what we should be looking at. We should be, where is it, a new decade, new approach? Well, it's old, it is new decade, but same approach. And what has happened and will continue to happen unless we have calming of the waters, this is going to take us back to the bad times. I hope it doesn't. But realistically, as I said, is with this protocol, that's what people voted for. I didn't vote for it. And as I said, is regarding a border poll, is whether or not it ever does happen, I don't know. But as I said, I will do as Labour are supposed to be the honour broker of the Good Friday Agreement. I will, as I said, and if there is a Labour Party in Northern Ireland, I will be of the position that is say every member can vote whatever way they see fit, and and that's that. And people say, "Oh, you must take a position on it." No, I don't. It says it's clean in the Good Friday Agreement, called at the behest of the Secretary of State at that time, and for the people to choose, and that is my attitude. And people say, "Oh, you're a nationalist party, you're union." I says, no, we're not. I says, we're supposed to be an all-inclusive party. But the fact is, we be discriminated. We have so much to offer. It is about time and we need to engage with the trade unions to get us, because the trade unions are the forefront. They're the ones that fund the Labour Party. They're the ones that without the trade unions we're nothing, because we're supposed to be for workers' rights, for for the elderly, the vulnerable, etc. We need to be focusing on making sure we have got the trade unions on board. I will try my best. Whether or not, we'll see what happens with me legally, but I am confident. But as I said, we need to be, everything that has happened recently is down to the language of certain people, certain politicians. And basically, it's all right. One rule for them. Oh, Bobby Story's funeral. What about Sammy Wilson not wearing a mask 3 or 4 occasions? And not one calling of it out from the party leader, Arlene Foster. It's an absolute disgrace. We need, if we're going to have a future, a socialist future with socialist policies, we've got to start we have to be anti-sectarianism. We've got to promote, otherwise we could go back to the bad old days. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. And I hope you have the same success with the challenge to the Labour Party. It's interesting that the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, refuses to allow the Northern Ireland Labour Party to stand candidates in its own name. Yet, the advice that they give is that there is a sister party in the Socialist International, the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party. As Eileen explained earlier, the Social Democratic and Labour Party evolved from a Republican Labour background, from a Northern Ireland Labour background, and from a nationalist party background. But it has evolved into a middle-class nationalist organisation, representing very well the interests of the middle-class Catholics. A while back, they did a deal with Fianna Fáil, which until the economic collapse, world economic collapse, Fianna Fáil was the dominant political party in the South. It had its mantra that it was the party of no property, or the party of the people of no property. But the reality was it was a capitalist party then, it's a capitalist party now, and it will be a capitalist party in the future. And it's now tied through agreements and shared interests with the SDLP. And this is the organisation that Labour in Britain is insisting that should be supported rather than Northern Ireland Labour Party. Now, there's one other aspect on that particular argument I want to bring up, and that is the question of the role of some trade unionists. There are some unions who have expressed opposition to the Northern Ireland Labour Party getting the right to stand candidates. And it would appear from looking back at those union leaders, most of them are talking in favour of a document called Uniting Ireland, Uniting Workers, this particular document. It has a picture of James Connolly on the back of it, and it has a quotation by Connolly inside. But this document does not use the word socialism anywhere within its glossy covers. It doesn't talk about a political party to represent Labour. It campaigns on the idea of trade unionists uniting to support the border poll campaign. It is my opinion that it is a document that is, and I'm basing this on the list of names of people who have endorsed it. It doesn't say who published it, but there's a strong current of people who have relationships with Sinn Fein and others with the Communist Party. At the opening session of this meeting, Michael mentioned and Harry mentioned the 2 stages theory of communism, which is adopted by the Communist Party in Ireland, an organisation which itself has interestingly split 3 times in the last while, once by expulsion and second by the disaffiliation of their youth section. So it's an organisation of fossils at the best. But it is an organisation which has produced a document which we will find, and I have no doubt about it, it will find sympathy with a lot of trade unionists in the South, but it's a document that has to be argued against for the reasons that the comrades have mentioned earlier. I'm now going to open the meeting to the floor, and I would ask comrades, I actually have the meeting on 2 screens, so if you want to, you can just put your hand up and I can try and call you. And I know the speakers went on a little bit longer than normal, but I would ask comrades to excuse that because of the quality of the information and the quality of the comrades as well. So it's over to the floor now. Finn?
Their contributions were excellent in highlighting the role of the labour movement in Irish history, and that gets very little attention. And it's great to hear Eileen talking about her experiences in Derry with the Derry Trades Council, and incidentally, Eileen's late husband, Bill Webster, played a really, really important role in building the labour movement there. And the trades councils across the north played a big role. And the emphasis in the media is never on that. It's all about Sinn Fein and the unionists. So I want to make some comments in that regard. By the way, James Connolly, the great Irish socialist, said that partition would create a carnival of reaction. That's the expression he used. And Eileen explained exactly what that meant in the north. We've had the same in the south. With the abortion was illegal, contraception was illegal, divorce was illegal, the education system was given to the Catholic Church. Incidentally, more than 90% of kids in the north go to segregated schools. And that's a direct consequence of the carnival reaction. Now, I'm not going to talk for very long, so just make a point about Sinn Fein. Sinn Fein is presented in the media as the progressive force and the unionists as the reactionary force, a completely false representation. It's worth remembering that Fianna Fáil in the south, which Jimmy spoke about just now, and Fine Gael in the south, both resulted from splits in Sinn Fein. Sinn Fein was formed as a bourgeois party, Fianna Fáil split, and also a Fine Gael split at different times. I myself was at a conference in 1970 where Sinn Fein split yet again. And what happened then was that what's now the provisional Sinn Fein and provisional IRA split with Sinn Fein at that time because Sinn Fein was developing a left-wing program and was trying to turn away from pure militaristic tactics in the north. So there was the founding of the provisional Sinn Fein, a fight against the left, and a turn instead towards militarism. But more recently, what Sinn Fein are now looking for, and it's a stated position, they want to form a coalition government with either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael in the south. That's their perspective. There was no conference decision, no discussion, no open consideration, just an announcement by Mary Lou McDonald that she would form a coalition government with either of these two parties. It's also worth noting, I was surprised to read this, that Michelle O'Neill last week paid tribute to the royal family and the positive role that they played in solving the Irish problems in their endeavours to help the situation in the north of Ireland, paying tribute, a Republican so-called, to a monarchy. And she highlighted as the main illustration of that the meeting between Martin McGuinness at that time and IRA, the Sinn Féin deputy leader of the Assembly, and the Queen, elevating that meeting as a tribute and praising the monarchy. Now that shows where Sinn Féin are at the moment. It's an opportunistic party. On the border poll, well, under the Good Friday Agreement, politicians have to identify as either nationalist or unionist or other. That's a totally sectarian position. We can't support that. I also noticed in the media a presentation of nationalist and Catholic as being the same thing, and Protestant and unionist as being the same thing. We must stand up against this propaganda. It's a bit like what happened in England. People were described as Brexiteers or Remainers, as if that was some kind of badge of life, badge of identity for the rest of your life. People vote differently at different elections. The Labour movement has drawn from Protestants and from Catholics. The Trades Council in Newton Abbey, the activities of that around some areas in the north, Belfast Trades Council, would be predominantly Protestant. Innes McCormick and these leaders that were also highlighted illustrate the same. So to equate Catholic and nationalists as the same thing, and to equate Unionists and Protestants as the same thing, is completely incorrect. And that's where the border poll notion comes from. Let's catch them now, when we have a majority of Catholics. And there's no guarantee it will be carried. I mean, Ireland has posited the possibility of 51-49. There's no guarantee at all that people in the south would necessarily vote for unity. There's a 12 million euro subvention annually from the British government to the north. The south couldn't take that on. There would be huge cuts in living standards in the south were that to happen. And these issues are not examined. Just one final point. There's a lot of positives in the activities of the Labour movement as well. We shouldn't only focus on the defeats and betrayals. Even in the south, for all their faults, the Irish Labour Party stood for a socialist republic in the 30s. That was the stated policy of the party. In 1969, the party moved significantly to the left and became the main opposition. In more recent times, in the election before last, 2011, Irish Labour Party could have formed a government, could have fought to form a government at that time, but instead it went into a coalition, as Harry has alluded to as well. In the north, there's been lots and lots of examples where the Labour movement has stood either through trades councils or community groups against the prevailing mood. And it's a good demand, which all the criminals have raised, that the Irish Trade Union Congress, and in particular the Northern Ireland Committee of the Congress, must take on board this demand to form a Labour Party, because that is the only way in which we can break the sectarian divide that now exists in the north. So I want to thank the criminals again for the very illuminative and very informative contributions. And it's great to hear people who are working on the ground, given their experiences of the events that are happening around them at the present time.
Thanks, Finn. One thing that just reminded me there, Finn is originally from Limerick, and Harry, and I think it was in his contribution, mentioned the period after or during the War of Independence in Ireland in the 1919-1921 period. There was the establishment of workers' councils and the establishment of Soviets. One of the people who became a dominant personality in Irish politics for a long time was Eamon de Valera. His home was a little village brewery in Limerick. And I saw a photograph the other day which really impressed me. And it was a photograph of a co-op in brewery, and it had on a banner across the top, brewery, we make bread, not profits. But after brewery was the word Soviet. So it was brewery Soviet, we make bread, not profits. And that was something that was developing in the early part of this state and during the period of the War of Independence. And a lot of these, the opposition to the establishment of these Soviets actually came from within the Republican movement. And the brewery one in particular was leaned on by Sinn Fein and leaned on by the church in Limerick. And it was frozen out and handed back to the bosses. But that link of republicanism and the state, or the republicanism and the church within the state, has existed right up to the present day, despite the fact that the churches have been pushed back and back again by the younger generations. I now ask, is there any other speaker would like to come in? Right, go ahead, John. Is it John or Dominic?
It's Dominic, yeah.
Okay.
I just thinking back on the sort of my limited knowledge of Irish history, but the stuff I read some time ago drew me to the conclusion, as far as the Irish capitalists in the South were concerned, they abandoned the idea of a united Ireland in 1913 when they were faced with the Dublin lockout. They're trying to crush the trade union movement, but seeing the strength of the labour movement in front of them, the spectre of organised workers from the north joining that frightened them to death. And I think their concept of a united Ireland is some pipe dream for the future that is a Mayday speech type of thing. The other thing that got me yesterday is, having read the notice for this, I went on the computer and I downloaded this trade union vision for a new and united Ireland. And it starts off with a quote that's been used earlier, I think Finn mentioned it, about the betrayal of, a sectarian feast would be the result of partition, was what he was talking about. The thing is now that a vote, in the sense of the way these people put it forward in this pamphlet, is about changing your wallpaper. They put it's on that sort of level. We have a vote and then we all decide, and it's done. No idea of the social issues facing the North. No idea of what sort of sectarianism it's going to stir up in the North and put the Labour movement back. I don't think they're interested in that, because the document, to my mind, is full of lamentation by these trade unionists about the horrible right-wing capitalists they've got in the South, and that somehow a united Ireland will solve all the problems of the working class. And that's what they put over in this document. There's not a plan, not a stitch about any sort of trade union action of solidarity on any issue, and about campaigning. They complain about the ILO not being accepted in the South, not the ILO Convention on the Rights for Association not been accepted. The foreword to this is written by the General Secretary or President, of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions in a personal capacity. But I would say, having been involved in a trade union, any president who does something in a personal capacity has got the nod from the rest of them, from the executive and all the rest of it. But there's the fact that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions sits around the table with these reactionary capitalists and the reactionary governments and draws up wages and conditions agreements for the working class in the South never seems to cross their mind that they should oppose it. You've had Labour Party governments, I didn't realise, Labour Party in coalition in the South, I didn't realise they were so split from the trade union movement now. But they've never raised an issue about this, even this ILO thing coming in, the right to association. So I just think that these people, I thought when I saw the title of it, I thought this is a Sinn Fein document, because if you want United Ireland, the only way it's going to be achieved is by the trade union movement and the Labour movement uniting on serious issues to start with, like wages, housing and all the rest of it, and mounting a campaign across Ireland on that to give strength and unity to the working class. And that will be the pathway for achieving a united Ireland. But a united Ireland, uniting with other socialist countries is the banner that should be raised as well. So I think, I don't know how much of a threat these people are, but they just seem to me to want to stir up a sort of sectarian thing, or just bolster Sinn Fein as an election process, that they're looking to do all these wonderful things. But all these wonderful things they promise in the document, they don't promise. They just say could. This could happen. That could happen. You could get £50 a day for standing on a corner. Anything can happen. Yeah, it's absolute sort of nonsense as a document. Sorry for ranting, but it just got me go.
Well, I hope it gets to go for many others, Dominic, because my judgment on it is it's a document with the theory of the CP and the ambition of Sinn Fein. And since a lot of CP money and what little membership they have left is invested in Sinn Fein, the two go hand in hand. I'm now going to ask Aman to come in.
I just wanted to thank, first of all, for the informative talk that was given. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks very much for all the comments who actually talked. There was one thing which I thought is interesting, and I have a question as well, if that could be answered. On one hand, we've had a scenario where, I'm just saying in terms of similarity, where you see, for example, in Lebanon is the same, in Iraq is the same, where constitutions are drawn, the parties who come to power are the ones who have been agreed upon by some other power at the time, and therefore the whole scenario of the government and the rule or assemblies that they have are all predetermined. In a way, for example, if you consider somebody in Iraq, you have to have the president from Kurdistan, for example, and or in Lebanon, you have to have it from somebody from Hezbollah, somebody has to come from the Christian side. And it seems all the time there is a problem which is to do with religion. It's got nothing to do with religion. It seems to be similar scenarios when everybody talks. You see the experiences are very much shared across many different parts of the world. That's one thing. Probably also, in addition, from the talk that was given, I picked up was the idea of the notion that you see in media a lot of times, and that is the idea of equating Protestant with British government, Catholic with obviously the revolutionary, and the notion that the religion is apparently, again, the cause and the divide in terms of politics, which is definitely not the case from what was also said in here as well. But I have a question here as well. If there is a scenario, or if there is a question, I always thought that we always look at it a little bit more pragmatically and see what serves the interest of the working class best. So from that point of view, workers do not have borders, that's obvious. But the question is, if there is a movement, a national question in here, what would be the answer of the left? To say that there is a socialist answer is true everywhere. But the question is, every movement needs its own solutions, needs its own program, needs its own manifesto. What would be the issue from a socialist angle to resolving the nationalist issue? If there is a movement, then it needs a solution. And if we don't provide that solution by saying socialism would provide the answer, that gap would be filled up by other bourgeois parties. It has done everywhere. So my question was, what is the socialist answer to the movement of the national question in Northern Ireland, which would resolve and provide an answer? It doesn't mean that it does necessarily mean it has to be anything specific, but very much the case of an answer to a movement. Every movement needs an answer and needs a solution. And that solution needs to be clear. Otherwise, it becomes, oh, the United Ireland is going to be the answer, as Dominic correctly said, that as if it's going to solve every problem of the workers, or none. So what is the actual socialist answer to the national question with regard to Northern Ireland? Thank you.
Joe.
Yeah, I know that a timely question, because that's where my contribution comes in. I think we need to be looking at not just being in the defensive situation where we're put in the position of having to oppose this intervention by these basically nationalist trade unionists and trade unions who are looking to bolster the concept of a border poll and get it through. We'll be put in the position of saying no, right? And the weird sort of people who are a bit unreasonable. Like, what could be more? See, the problem with the reason why Labour was told to wait, and why socialists were told to wait in the past, was always, let's get the nationalist question out of the way, and then we can deal with the issues of workers' unity around all the things that workers actually need in the new society. And it sounds so logical, and it's sold as being so practical, whereas the voices that are looking to do it the other way around, like our own voices, right, who believe that unless you actually unite people first, you'll end up with a sectarian bloodbath or a nightmare in the future. So instead of us being on the defensive, let's do what the previous comrade says, and let's actually advance a solution. And are we in a position to be able to move the debate forward? And I'm looking at the way around 30%, I've forgotten the exact figure. I know there's different figures at different times, but in society, in Northern Ireland, in polls, 30 to 40% of people don't identify as being either nationalist or unionist. And that figure can obviously fluctuate. But if you've got a large chunk of people who don't identify as either green or orange, then that's our foundation stone. And particularly the new younger generation coming up, that don't want to see a return to the old green versus orange society, which this border poll will just basically bring back that conflict center stage again. And a bit like the Brexit debate took off and went out of control. This debate could take off and go out of control as well. And we're in the position of shouting from the sidelines, whereas the main debate will be around sectarian issues about the border poll, yes or no, nationalist versus unionist, and so on. Again, to try and avoid us being in the situation where we're saying no, 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 we need to be in the position where we're saying, well, actually, we've got a worked out alternative. And there's a number of civic organizations, trade union, possibly we need to work to get this done, trade union organizations, community organizations that might support an alternative where you had neither orange nor green, but a socialist alternative. And I'm going to make that specific because, again, the previous comrade said, what does it actually mean in practice? It's easy to use a word like, let's have a socialist alternative. That's just a phrase, an empty phrase. We have to break that down into its component parts so that people can actually identify, yeah, I believe in that, I believe in that, I believe in that. Yeah, that hits the spot in so many, many ways, right? So I'm going to list a number of areas where we do not talk about a new United Ireland. We do not talk about a new society, except in the context of rights and what it's going to mean to you as a person who identifies with your British heritage or your Irish heritage. We don't think that's too important. We think we will address it in a different way, okay, under cultural rights. So I'm just going to go through what I would see as a 12-point program, right? First of all, people in Northern Ireland are unemployed, and there's a lot of unemployment, a lot of youth unemployment. To cut across the concept that you get so much of a subvention from Northern Ireland and so on, but you get very low social welfare payment in comparison to EU rates of social welfare payment, we should be putting forward the idea of a universal basic income. We should hit that very, very hard, and we say that everybody is entitled. If you're not working, you get a UBI, okay? In relation to wages, instead of a minimum wage, we want the same as in the south of Ireland and in the rest of Europe. Our socialist alternative, neither green or orange, socialist alternative means you get equality, you get a living wage, okay? In relation to, this is mentioned by Eileen Webster early on, trade union rights. We will institute the following trade union rights: right to join a trade union, the right to holiday pay, sick pay, and so on. All those things are itemized as being, this is stitched in central to our socialist alternative. This is what you get if you support this. You might think you're going to get it if you support the border poll, but we can argue, again, I don't want to go back to that debate. The next thing, point number 4, tenants and citizens' rights. That we look to what's the best available rights for citizens and tenants who are renting properties, renting their apartments, renting their flats, renting their houses in Europe. What are the rights that are the best, the optimum rights that are in Austria and in Belgium? And in those cases, we say we want the best for the citizens of Northern Ireland. In relation to cultural rights, people, it was mentioned earlier on, people have a right if they see they've got a British heritage. Well, instead of just saying, well, you've a right to be British, we break that down. You've a right to be Irish. We break that down. What does it actually mean? It means you have a right. Simple things. Nothing's going to change in relation to your coverage, your TV channel access to BBC, Channel 4, BBC 2, whatever. Same for if you think you believe you've your Irish heritage, that's not going to be endangered in this new society. We'll have RTE, we'll have the Irish TV channel, language channel, the TG-CAR. In relation to, I'll move on then, in relation to other areas like education and health are central to this as well. Again, central to the issue of heritage. Okay, so let's start with health. What's the best situation in relation to health for the population of Northern Ireland? The NHS. I know things are going on, Jimmy, but I'm trying to break it down in terms of the nuts and bolts of what this means. Health, it means you get the best of the NHS plus more. And that's welcome news to citizens in the south And in the north of Ireland, okay, only instead of NHS with cutbacks, you get NHS with more socialist type measures, more progressive measures. Education, we believe in integrated education. You advance that. There's plenty of organisations supporting that in the north of Ireland. We just link in with them, try and get them to sign up to that as well. In relation to employment programs, housing, we have our positions. In relation to green industries, it was mentioned about the lack of industry for the Protestant working class because of the closing down of so many of the manufacturing facilities. Again, we're looking at can we link in with those who are looking to institute new industries related to energy and so on in the north of Ireland. The environment, link in with the Greens and have sort of try and split them the way it's happening. There's a bit of a split going on in the south of Ireland, the left Greens versus right Greens. Left Greens will support the concept of an environmental aspect of this new manifesto. And I could go on, policing, the whole issue of community policing, non-sectarian community policing, an anti-sectarian, anti-racism program, workers' rights, women's rights. Again, women's rights is very obvious in relation to what Eileen had to say. Women's groups could support something like this if their rights were championed in a manifesto containing all these component parts. Our problem is, and I'm not living in cloud cuckoo land, our problem is we can put together a manifesto based on these 12, 13, 14 points. Where does it go? How do you get any traction with it? And that's where we have to see, is there any way we can get individuals, significant individuals like Bernadette McAliskey, like maybe somebody equivalent on the unionist side, who's a left-wing, senior left-wing people, to say, well, this is a better way to move forward than what's been proposed by some of these trades councils, been proposed by some of these who are pushing for the border poll first. I think there would be, if we put something together and we got a couple of significant people to back it, we could get support and traction for a socialist alternative beyond green and orange, and put it down in terms of concrete proposals, the nuts and bolts of how a socialist alternative would work in Northern Ireland. And I haven't got into the whole area of, before anyone shoots me down, of workers' control and so on, move that again in relation to trade union rights, in relation to democracy, workers' democracy and so on, could feature as part of that pamphlet, as part of that manifesto. Because I believe without that, without a charter that outlines a socialist alternative, if we're bleating and complaining and moaning about the proposal in relation to that, and I'm using those words because that's how we'll be portrayed. If we're just opposing what the nationalists are proposed, if we're just opposing it, we're in the position where we're losing, right? We have a much better chance if we say, actually, there is an alternative. And as I say, it's broken down and it's in touch with what all the key organizations are demanding, from women's organizations to union organizations, and so on. I don't need to repeat myself, right? So that's what we need to do. We need to put ourselves on the front foot, not on the defensive. And we have to find a way to do that, and maybe link in with British Labour Party members who are prepared to give that some traction as well. Maybe even as high as unlikely Jeremy Corbyn, given his flirtation with nationalism in the past. But there must be people out there who will support this kind of an initiative. And that's what I'm put on the table anyway. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. One thing just for the record, one of the first demands I would put, which would allow consideration of Joe's demands, is the creation of a structural platform for Labour. In other words, an all-Ireland Labour and Trade Union Party. And that would have to be the key, because the one thing that document does say, the negotiations will be done by the national capitalists and the international and multinational representatives. So it's important to have numbers at the table, and those numbers decided and based on the workers' interests. I'm going to ask Dave Hempston to come in now, and I think it's probably safe to say that we're going over time, and Dave will probably be the last speaker.
I've just put up a quote, from the Irish poet Brendan Kennelly, who apparently had his birthday yesterday. And he says, to be born in Ireland is to inherit not only the most beautiful little countries in the world, but also an entire legacy of prejudices, hatreds, cliches, an impressive supply of apparently invincible ignorance. And every great person who's lived in Ireland, every person of some cultural stature has actually had that aspiration, that this society would move forward and actually step by step, or is the way in which people see it would happen. And gradually new generations would arise and move beyond the ancient prejudices and hatreds. But we've seen that, you know, in the last couple of weeks, it's as though every step forward could ratchet right back again. And this is actually, you know, a terrible feeling, you know, from all those who've known the, you know, marvelous tradition that socialists have had in the past of fighting against sectarianism and being prepared, you know, to leave a sectarian bloc and to move across, you know, towards building a united youth and socialist movement, you know, for freedom and for unity. And actually, this is not just an Irish problem, because basically, at the moment, as The Economist has put it, Britain united has become Britain untied. In other words, all the parts of Britain which previously were cemented in place, you know, are now wanting to move outwards. And this has put the Irish Protestant, the Northern Ireland Protestants in a real dilemma. And they're caught in that dilemma. And there's no doubt on a sectarian basis, there's no way forward. And we've seen the aspirations from below, from much of the youth, you know, being thwarted. It's a terrible indictment of society when Finn can mention that 90% of the youth is educated in segregated institutions. This is horrific. And it shows that actually nothing will change until change is made. And the only united movement in a sense is that of the labor movement, but every institution is standing in the way of that unity. So, you know, we look to our comrades. It's marvelous to hear the details from Joe, you know, about what the alternatives would be, and they are very attractive. There's no way forward that on the current divided basis and the way in which the politics is posed by sectarian parties, that there can be a movement forward to those directions. So look, I'll just close then, not rather than go on. Hopefully we could get another comrade come in, that we could actually see, you know, a movement coming again of disgust with this sliding back into sectarianism after some advance, particularly in the South, in many ways in terms of civil rights and some social progress. And that would all slide back, and we would have the monsters of the past returning. We don't want that, and we want to support our comrades in every possible way to build a united workers' movement. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Normally, we would have a situation now where we would have some individual come in to sum up, but as we're running a bit over, I would just ask any of the four initial speakers if they want to add anything to their contribution. I see Harry's hand up already, and Michael. I give you about 2 minutes each.
I would like to take up the question that Amin has put forward, and he is right. It's not enough to unite the people in Ireland, I think, purely on a socialist programme. There needs to be additions put into that, particularly on the national question. Just on the socialist programme, a socialist programme, I mean, that document that Jimmy just held up there, it's really what's not. Jimmy said there's not even a word of socialism mentioned in it. What's also not mentioned in it is the nationalisation. Yeah. Workers owning the heights of the economy, transport and energy, all other aspects. Nationalisation is the centre of any socialist programme. People own the heights, or the commanding heights of the economy. The second thing that's not mentioned in that document is workers' unity. And workers' unity empowers workers in all areas: health, education, energy, environment, right across the board. And it's not that these committees is going to be run by any elected Dáil. Democratic control means that workers on the ground elect in their local areas the role of running all their services, health service, education, and so on. It is run by workers' committees, not by any elected Dáil that's going to come in with a new agenda. Workers' control has to be centre for any democratic socialist programme. That in itself will help to unite people around their own future that they wish to move forward in. The third thing is that any elected Dáil will not be run by Fianna Fáils and Fine Gaels, Sinn Féins, DUPs, any of them. These parties are capitalist parties. And we call for the removal, and the only way to do that is to stand on a mass movement, mass organisation of the Labour Party. So it's not going to be bourgeois sectarians that will be running over the people. It will be a Labour Party, an Ireland Labour Party, that will be running the people democratically elected. So that will be a decisive change of the situation, which in itself, one would certainly hope will help to unite people throughout the whole of Ireland. The key point is, on the nationalist question, the fear really will be, and in all Ireland, even under a socialist basis, is the fear of Protestants. They will see, will their identity be undermined, underwrote, and so on. We need to make a number of clear demands. Any identity, any commemorations, any celebrations, and that includes loyalist orange celebrations and all that, would be completely respected in any new state. But essentially, under a socialist programme, under that basis, would we give the right for Protestants, if they chose wish, and not that we would advocate, but would they, for a period of time, would they have a right to succession? Under a socialist Ireland, under a socialist programme, would we give them their right if they so demanded? I believe we should. I believe that should always be open. In order to win over the Protestant working class, if they felt that they would wish to have a separate state, hopefully only for an intermediate period of time, that I think should be on the agenda as well. It's not so much that you get rid of borders. If you have a program, borders evaporate, they disappear. And that's the best way to get rid of them. Allow them to disappear. But I think that should be in the program. So I hope that's at least partially answered Owen's question, a very important one at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Michael, last word to you.
Last word. Why do we have these problems? It starts off with who's the dominant class in society. In feudal times, the monarchy was the dominant class. And when the monarch decided, in order to gain territory or for whatever reason, to change his religion, on pain of death, everybody that was subservient to him had to change theirs. That's how some of this began. Come forward a bit, and when the dominant class was capitalism, they set up institutions, like the parliament, parliamentary system, and nations, in order to keep the lower orders under control. And in that, they invented the white race. And closer to home, they invented sectarianism. So what we need is for people not to identify with race, with nation, or with any of the things that belong to the dominant class. We need people to identify with class, their own working class. And if our programme that Joe has spelt out has that in it, that's a way forward. So what you need is to get rid of everything. You can't pick at the things that the dominant class has put there to divide us. you get rid of that class. You take the power from that class.
Thanks, Michael.